start this, 3 important eclipse essentials that you need to know. I'm Phaedra. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the artist and astrologer of Mystick, Physick, Astrology, and I use Western Sidereal Astrology in my practice to help you reconnect with your self-purpose and to help you remember why you came into this world in the first place. And my aim, as always, is to provide guidance on how we can consciously use the energy of the transiting planets to affect our lives in a positive way. In other words, to respond to our transits rather than simply react to our transits. And so we'll be talking about eclipses today from that perspective. So welcome to 3 important eclipse essentials that you need to know. Thank you for joining me on the live stream. I'm going to talk in depth on a couple different points that are important. We're going to go over pretty much everything that you need to know to navigate any eclipse season. So this will be a broadcast that if you need to come back and re-watch later on, watch the video to kind of get a refresher on eclipses and how they can affect you, you'll be able to do that because you'll be experiencing eclipses for the rest of your life. Approximately every 6 months you'll experience an eclipse season. So by the end of this video, you will know how eclipses can affect you, how to determine whether any given eclipse is going to affect you directly, and how to figure out how and why you'll be affected. So thank you for joining me. Please like and share this broadcast, tag a friend if you know someone who might be interested. You can also follow Mystick Physick on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks so much for subscribing. We've had a lot of people subscribe lately, and it's been nice to see. So eclipse season, let's talk about eclipse season. Eclipse season is known for bringing change, a great deal of change, whether through endings or through new beginnings, and especially for those of us who have natal planets or personal points at the eclipse degrees most of all. So eclipses, they pack a punch, right? They're many, many times stronger than a regular new or full moon. They're like full moons on steroids is what we like to say, right? So they're stronger than a normal lunation in that regard. And an eclipse, for instance, on the moon's north node. Hi, Stella. It's good to have you on. Thanks for joining me. So an eclipse on the moon's north node brings a rush of energy in, okay? And an eclipse on the south node can kind of suck energy out. And these energy surges that happen during eclipses can cause an opposite energetic effect in the opposite sign in the opposite house. So that's something to keep in mind as you are exploring how eclipses can affect you. It's not just the sign and house that an eclipse happens in that can be impacted. It can activate the opposite sign as well through the energetic nature of the eclipses. Now, eclipses always happen in pairs, sometimes in 3s, and they come about 2 weeks apart. Okay, so they bring big permanent change. Whether, like I was saying, endings, which usually happen with full moon eclipses, or beginnings, which usually happen with new moon eclipses. And often this change is completely beyond our ability to control, for better or for worse. And it usually demands that we adapt to whatever our new circumstances are, okay? And it's always, 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 whether it's a challenging experience or a pleasant experience, it's always necessary for our personal growth, what we experience because of an eclipse. Even though it can be painful when it's change that we've resisted for a really long time. And that's actually one thing that eclipses are known for, is for forcing change where you have resisted it, or in areas of life where you have allowed your life to grow stagnant, okay? They occur in pairs of signs in opposite signs of the zodiac, right? Because it's the new moon and the full moon. They always happen in opposite signs. They also happen in series over about 18 months, sometimes 24 months. And they initiate cycles of activity related to the themes of those signs and the houses that they fall into for you, okay? Now, there can be overlap between one eclipse series and the next, right when they're making that shift, okay? So they affect families of signs, and they can activate the opposite sign by the principle of polarity. So just because an eclipse is happening in one sign or one house does not mean that that's the only place where you will feel it or where it might have an effect. So you want to be cognizant of your entire chart when you're considering eclipses, okay? So eclipses also expose what's hidden from your awareness. They bring to light essential information. They'll expose secrets. Almost always this is information that you need, especially that you need in the course of decision making, okay? And so because of this, and because eclipses are so unpredictable, we typically recommend waiting to take action and giving any given eclipse the space of a few days before taking action, just because something can come up. And we'll have an example of this later on that I think is a really perfect example. So new people can come into our lives during eclipses, whether that's by meeting someone or someone being born, and folks that we've known for a long time can leave our lives. So maybe longtime neighbors, or friends, or coworkers. Sometimes someone leaves due to a death or passing, okay? And usually when a relationship dissolves under an eclipse influence, it's a permanent ending with very little likelihood of reconciliation or reunion. Now, one example that I love to use, and I will confess, totally, I'm stealing this from Lynn Coiner, who is an amazing astrologer. She uses this example about eclipses, Charles and Camilla's wedding. And I love it. We'll get into why I love it here in a second. So in February of 2005, it was announced that Camilla Parker Bowles and Charles, Prince of Wales, were going to get married, right? It was announced that they were going to be married on the 8th of April that same year, okay? Now, that happened to be the exact day of an eclipse, okay? On the 4th of April, so just days before the eclipse itself, it was announced that they would have to postpone the wedding for 24 hours until the 9th of April. And that was so that Prince Charles could attend the funeral of Pope John Paul II, who had passed away really unexpectedly. Okay? So he had to attend the funeral as a representative of the Queen, and they had to postpone their nuptials. So this example, I love Lynn's example because it illustrates so many different aspects of how eclipses can play out, and why it's important to be cognizant of when they're happening, and especially when you know that they're going to affect you directly. It touches a little bit, it's an example of how things can change unexpectedly in the days near an eclipse. Hi Shauna, it's good to have you on. The death of a prominent figure, in this case the Pope, so someone permanently leaving our lives. And it also is significant of permanent and major life changes, a marriage, okay? So it's a wonderful example of the kinds of things that can happen near eclipse time. They're very powerful. Now, remember that the stars, and when we say the stars in this statement, we include the planets, okay? The stars impel, but they do not compel, which is to say that you can react to their potential unconsciously, or you can respond to them consciously and use their influence quite deliberately, especially in your natal potentials, by progression, and even by transits, okay? And what I mean by that is, so in the previous example of Charles and Camilla's wedding, hi Nancy, they were left reacting to events at the very last minute, sudden events, events that threw things into disarray, okay? But you can also choose to ride the energy, to use it deliberately to accomplish something that you want to accomplish, okay? So for example, I did this myself back in 2010 on July 11th. I chose that date to quit smoking, and I had chosen that date several months in advance. I knew that I would be quitting smoking that year because my husband was also a smoker, and some good friends of ours were also a smoker, and we had been kind of for years talking about quitting smoking together that particular year, when we knew we would be living in the same area and that we could be supportive of one another in trying to quit, right? And so I chose that particular date for myself. We all chose our own quit dates, but we chose probably, I would say, within a couple weeks of each other. I chose July 11th knowing that it was an eclipse and that it was an opportunity for permanent change. When I quit smoking on that day, that exact day, I switched to nicotine gum with the occasional use of like an e-cigarette just in the initial days of quitting smoking. Within 2 weeks, I had no more desire to use either of them, and I've had no cravings since. That was 8 years ago. Now, that particular eclipse happened conjunct my ascendant. Okay, so it allowed me to quite naturally ride that energy into starting a new life as a non-smoker. Okay, so this is what I want you to think about as you explore eclipses in your own life, how any individual eclipse might affect you. Know that there's a way that you can choose to use it to move your life forward in a positive direction, regardless of how challenging or not challenging the eclipse may seem. Okay? Now, the way that you can know how strongly or directly that you'll be affected by an eclipse is whether you have planets or personal points like the ascendant within up to 5 degrees or so of either side of the eclipse degree. Okay? Those planets and points can be activated by the eclipse. Those are the folks who are going to feel it most strongly. Now, we may still be affected if the eclipse happens in our sun sign or in our rising sign, even if we don't share a degree with the eclipse. Might not feel it quite as strong, but we can still feel it personally. Now, if we don't share a chart contact or signs with an eclipse, then we might feel the effects more indirectly, and that would be through other people in our lives who are feeling it directly. So friends or family or coworkers, maybe partner, your children. As they experience an eclipse touching them directly, you'll feel just the related. You'll be an observer. You might have to deal with whatever's going on with them, right? Now, we were talking about how they're so strong compared to regular lunations. With that strength, they have a broader area of influence. They have a strong influence of up to 2 months, so 60 days before or so, 60 days or so, before or after the date of the actual eclipse. Okay? So those influences can occur when the sun, although sometimes when the moon, transits that same degree in a neighboring sign. And so what this means is that some folks will feel the effects of the eclipse 2 months before it actually happens. A slightly larger group of people will feel it about a month before it actually happens. And then the bulk of people will feel it within 2 weeks, the week before and the week after of when it actually happens. And then again, the month after and 2 months after, the number of people who experience it will decline. So it's kind of like a bell curve in that way, that distribution over that 60 days before or after period. Okay? Now, a very small percentage of people then will have heard their eclipse news way before. And we had one eclipse recently, right? And then we'll have more folks who are going to still feel it coming up. But typically within the week before and the week after are when most folks will receive their news. Now, eclipses can also have an effect for the coming year. Individual eclipses, not just the whole cycle, but an individual eclipse can have an effect for up to a year following. As they continue to make aspects similar in nature to the initial aspect that an eclipse formed to a natal planet or point in your chart. Okay, the strongest influence usually plays out within that month of when the eclipse happens. Okay, now what I mean by this, when I say as they continue to make aspects similar in nature to the initial aspect formed to a natal planet or point, is that if the initial aspect is square, for instance, to a natal planet, the lunation that happens months later will reactivate that degree. It'll be occurring at a square to the eclipse degree that originally happened, and it'll reactivate that eclipse energy again at the opposite lunation you'll feel an effect. And then finally again at the closing square, which would happen about 9 or so months later, right? So this usually occurs in essentially the same way for all other aspects. So for instance, if you're talking about an eclipse that happens trine to a natal planet, for instance, that eclipse is reactivated as the following lunations happen at sextiles and trines to the first eclipse. Okay, and that would be if you have a natal planet or point making an aspect to an eclipse within roughly 3 degrees of either side of the eclipse degree. Okay, so there's a little bit of an orb, there's a little bit of wiggle room. It doesn't have to be the exact same degree. If it's really close, you will likely feel it. Now, additionally, eclipses have longer 19-year cycles called Saros cycles, in which they reoccur at the exact same sign and degree. And what that does is it triggers events related to significant events that happened 19 years prior, okay? And it moves them further into the next stage of development. So if you are over 19 years of age, you can try this practice. When you have an eclipse coming up that's going to touch something personal for you, think back to what events were happening 19 years before. What was taking place in your life 19 years prior? And you should see a theme where you can connect different events. So that's a little more long-term cycle, but it can be very relevant, especially for anyone who's over 19 years of age. If you have questions, go ahead and pop them into the comment box. I'd be happy to address them. I don't know that I've missed any, but I'm going to double check real quick. And then one last point that I wanted to talk on. I know I have said in the past in other broadcasts in the group, there's one final point that you'll want to note about eclipses, and that is eclipse season is a really poor time to give an ultimatum. Okay? The reason for this is because ultimatums tend to backfire during eclipse season, and when they do, they kind of backfire spectacularly, and the damage that can be done, because it's at an eclipse time, the damage that is done from that can be permanent, and you may not want that. Okay? So don't give any ultimatums right now. I would definitely wait. If that's something that you've been considering, just wait and hold off until it's a safer time. So that's one thing that I would want you to keep in mind, that is a caveat at eclipse time. Don't give ultimatums. Now, if you want something bad to happen, maybe you could give an ultimatum and just kind of play with it and see if it backfires spectacularly in your favor, right? But just know that you would be taking a risk to do that. So I wouldn't take too big a risk maybe the first time if I'm playing with that as a way to ride eclipse energy. And I want to thank you for joining me on the live stream. If you got value from what we've talked about today, please like and share the broadcast. If you have a friend that might benefit from any of this, feel free to tag them in the comments. And then again, you can always follow us on Facebook and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And especially if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you won't miss any of these videos because I upload them later, so that you can always know where to go catch the latest video if you missed us live. Okay. Marianne says, oh my, I gave my daughter an ultimatum this afternoon and she blew me off. I'm going to be more careful now. That's yes. Yes, yes, yes. And the problem with that is then now you're in the spot where, do you follow through or not? And if you don't follow through on an ultimatum, then that undermines your ability to use that kind of leverage with that person in the future. Okay. And it's funny that for some reason I wrote up all my notes and I didn't include that piece of advice, but I'm glad it came to me before we finished the broadcast, because it is an important thing to know, especially where endings can be permanent during eclipse season. So don't give ultimatums. I just recommend against it. And if you have important stuff planned, try to give the day before the day of and the day after the eclipse a little bit of a wider berth if you are making plans